William and Zachary Zulok were once the embodiment of the American dream. To the outside world, they were an ideal couple, successful, charitable, and well-respected members of their suburban Georgia community. They had everything: a beautiful home, a family, and a life that many would envy. The two men appeared to be living in a picture-perfect world, one that was full of love, prosperity, and stability. They had adopted two young boys, siblings who had been taken from foster care, and created a life that, on the surface, seemed to shine with happiness. Their social media accounts were full of smiling photos, vacations to exotic destinations, and snapshots of their perfect family. They were frequently seen attending church, participating in community events, and helping out with local charities. William, a former businessman, and Zachary, a community-minded individual, were seen as pillars of society, the kind of couple that made everyone else feel proud to be associated with them. No one ever questioned their intentions. No one suspected that beneath the surface of their seemingly flawless life, a darker story was unfolding. But something sinister was brewing inside their home, hidden behind the walls of their pristine house. While the world saw them as a couple of success, the truth was far more horrific. The picture-perfect family was merely a facade, a mask behind which unspeakable horrors took place. Inside the walls of that seemingly safe home, William and Zachary's two adopted boys were subjected to a nightmare that no child should ever experience. The abuse was not just physical, but psychological as well. Methods of control, manipulation, and terror were used to break the boys' spirits. The boys, who had been taken in with the promise of love and stability, found themselves trapped in a world where fear, not love, governed every moment of their lives. They had been given up by their biological parents, placed in a system that offered them hope for a better future. They were adopted by William and Zachary, who presented themselves as the perfect couple, promising to give the boys a family, a home, a place where they would feel safe. But instead, what they got was a prison. As the days went by, the couple's true nature began to reveal itself. What had initially appeared as affection turned into something dark, twisted, and manipulative. The boys were subjected to unspeakable horrors in the safety of their own home, forced to participate in abuse they couldn't possibly understand. The cycle of abuse wasn't an isolated incident. It was a planned, calculated effort to break them down, to control them, and to subject them to the most horrific acts imaginable. The abuse wasn't just physical, it was systematic. William and Zachary had a network, a sinister group that they had access to. They manipulated the boys into participating in these disturbing acts for their own gratification, recording them, sharing them, as if they were trophies to be flaunted. They had gone beyond the abuse itself, turning the boys into tools of a sick, exploitative system. The couple was so engrossed in their dark desires that they took steps to conceal their actions, manipulating the system in place to protect children. Behind the carefully curated facade of their social lives, a twisted reality was unfolding that no one would have ever guessed. Then the unthinkable happened. A tip was received, an anonymous whisper that something wasn't right in the Zulok's home. The authorities took action, and a full investigation was launched. It was clear from the moment they entered the house that this was not the life the boys were promised. Hidden cameras, recordings, and a plethora of disturbing material were uncovered. What had been concealed for so long was finally exposed for the world to see. The chilling discovery was beyond comprehension. These two men, who had been welcomed into the community as upstanding citizens, were in reality the architects of a nightmare. They had created a world where they were in control, a world where their adopted sons were nothing more than objects of their perverse desires. The realization of what had transpired behind closed doors left the investigators speechless. The community was stunned, unable to process the fact that the two men they had once trusted and admired had perpetrated such horrors. How could this have happened? How could these seemingly perfect men trusted by all commit such unimaginable acts? The revelations left a ripple effect, not only on the family and friends who had once considered them role models, but also on everyone who heard the news. The Zulok's home, once the picture of suburban bliss, was now forever marked as the site of an unspeakable crime. The pain, the trauma, and the damage done to the boys were immeasurable. No child should ever have to experience the kind of horror they endured. Yet despite the overwhelming evidence, the couple's denials continued. They tried to cover their tracks, claiming that the accusations were false, that they had been set up, that the truth was far less sinister. But the weight of the evidence, the video recordings, the testimonies, the brutal facts, spoke louder than any defense they could muster. They were caught in their web of lies, unable to escape the truth of their monstrous actions. The moment their crimes were uncovered, the media erupted. News outlets picked up the story, the headlines screamed with horror, and social media was flooded with reactions from people across the country, all horrified by the details. The once celebrated couple was now being vilified for the unspeakable abuse they had committed. Shockwaves reverberated throughout the community and beyond, with parents, child advocates, and citizens everywhere demanding justice for the two innocent boys whose lives had been irrevocably shattered by their adoptive parents. As the investigation continued, and as the true scale of their crimes became clearer, the world watched with bated breath. The question on everyone's mind was not just about how such horror had been allowed to occur, but also about how to prevent such monstrous actions from ever happening again. Could the system designed to protect children have missed such a glaring red flag? How could two men who had everything destroy the lives of those they were entrusted to protect? As the trial approached, the facts were damning, and the verdict would be as devastating as the crime itself. The Zulaks had gone from being the ideal couple to being nothing more than the embodiment of evil in the eyes of the public. Their sentencing, which would come soon after, would bring justice to the victims, but no amount of punishment could ever undo the damage they had caused. The victims, though now removed from the toxic home, would carry the scars of their abuse for the rest of their lives. This was a crime that would forever haunt everyone involved, and the questions surrounding the Zulaks' true motivations would linger long after the final gavel came down. The horror that was unfolding behind closed doors in the Zulak household reached a chilling crescendo. Once investigators dug deeper into their lives, it wasn't just the physical acts of abuse that shocked those who uncovered it. It was the calculated, methodical nature of their actions. William and Zachary Zulak didn't simply engage in abuse. They manipulated and controlled their adopted children, coercing them into a world of fear and degradation that no child should ever have to endure. The trauma they inflicted wasn't just physical, it was psychological, emotional, and spiritual, slowly eroding the very foundation of what it meant to be loved and cared for. The Zulaks' crimes were not isolated incidents. They were systematic. Every moment of the children's lives had been shaped by this malevolent manipulation. The couple not only abused them behind closed doors, but used their power and authority as adoptive parents to keep them in a state of fear and submission. The boys were taught to believe that what was happening to them was normal, that there was no other way to live. There was no escape from the terror that filled the walls of their home. What made the situation even more horrifying was the meticulousness with which they covered their tracks. The Zulaks had built an empire of misery, using their charm and status to hide their sickening behavior from the outside world. No one suspected anything. In fact, they were seen as the perfect family. William and Zachary were well known in their community for their involvement in local events, church activities, and social causes. They seemed like pillars of the community, men who had everything going for them. But this perfect image was a mask, carefully maintained to cover up the horrors they were inflicting upon the two boys. Behind that mask, the couple had created an environment where the children were their captives, stripped of any sense of freedom, joy, or security. The boys, unable to understand why they were being hurt, were groomed into believing that their abuse was somehow a necessary part of their lives. This psychological manipulation was just as damaging as the physical violence. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that their actions were not just the result of momentary loss of control or stress. This was planned, deliberate. The Zulaks had constructed a system where they could keep the boys locked in this cycle of abuse without arousing suspicion. Evidence mounted, photographs, recordings, and a series of digital files showing the horrific acts they had committed. The couple had even filmed the abuse, using it as a way to justify their actions to themselves and to share with others in a twisted network that supported their dark desires. These recordings weren't simply a way to relive the trauma. They were a method of reinforcing control, a tool to ensure the boys remained trapped in their torment. When law enforcement officials arrived at the Zulak's home, the scene was nothing short of terrifying. The boys were found in a state of shock and fear, their eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and terror. They were finally free from the men who had tormented them for so long, but the damage had already been done. The mental and physical scars they would carry would last a lifetime. The evidence they uncovered was so damning that there was no doubt about what had happened inside those walls. William and Zachary had meticulously hidden the truth, but now the truth had been uncovered, and it was far darker than anyone could have imagined. The discovery of the abuse sent shockwaves through the community. William and Zachary had been trusted figures, respected by those around them, admired for their ability to portray themselves as loving and dedicated parents. No one, not even the people closest to them, had seen the warning signs. Their dark secret had been carefully concealed under layers of charm, smiles, and well-placed public appearances. To think that such evil could exist behind the facade of normalcy was almost incomprehensible to those who knew them. How could two men who had everything, status, wealth, and love, commit such monstrous acts? The media frenzy that followed the discovery was overwhelming. News outlets fluttered with stories about the couple, detailing their once-perfect life and their eventual unraveling. The public was horrified. Social media exploded with reactions from people across the world, demanding justice for the two innocent boys whose lives had been destroyed by the men they had been entrusted to. The image of a perfect family had been shattered, and in its place was a story of betrayal, manipulation, and unimaginable cruelty. As the investigation continued, the media picked up on the smallest details of the couple's life, tracing their financial dealings, their public persona, and even their history. There were no easy answers to be found. How could these men who had everything throw it all away for such a sickening crime? What could have driven them to abuse and manipulate children to such an extreme? The questions multiplied and the public demanded answers. But none of the answers seemed to be enough to explain how this had happened. With each passing day, the gravity of the crime became more and more apparent. The boys' trauma wasn't just about the abuse itself. It was about the years of manipulation, the psychological damage, and the devastation of having their trust betrayed by the very people they had turned to for care and protection. They had been taken from foster care, placed in the Zulak's home, and told they would be loved. But instead, they had been subjected to a hellish existence, one that no child should ever have to endure. When William and Zachary were arrested, they showed no remorse. Their actions in the aftermath of their arrest only served to deepen the mystery of their true motivations. They tried to maintain their innocence, claiming that the accusations were false, that the evidence was fabricated, and that they were the victims of a smear campaign. The public was outraged. How could they deny what was so clearly visible? How could they justify their actions in the face of overwhelming evidence? But even as they fought the charges, the trial moved forward. The overwhelming evidence stacked against them made it almost impossible to believe their denials. The boys, who had been brave enough to testify, described their abuse in chilling detail. Their courage in standing up and telling the truth was the only glimmer of hope in a case that seemed almost too horrific to believe. These young boys, scarred by the actions of the men who should have loved and protected them, were now the heroes in a story of survival, a story that would bring justice to the darkness that had once engulfed them. The trial was filled with raw emotion. The victims' families, who had suffered the most, spoke of the devastating impact that this abuse had had on their lives. They described the boys' pain, the struggles they faced every day as they tried to come to terms with what had been done to them. The sense of betrayal, the broken trust, and the irreparable damage were all laid bare in the courtroom. And yet, there was no turning back. The boys were free from the nightmare, but their healing was only just beginning. As the trial drew to a close, the world waited for the verdict. What would the punishment be for such monstrous crimes? The court proceedings, the evidence, and the testimony all pointed to one truth. William and Zachary had taken something irreplaceable from those boys. their innocence. The judge had the difficult task of determining a sentence that could even begin to reflect the damage done. When the verdict was read, the courtroom was silent. William and Zachary were sentenced to 100 years in prison without the possibility of parole. It was the harshest punishment available, but even then, no sentence could bring back what had been taken from the children. It wasn't just a punishment. It was a statement, one that declared that these crimes could never be justified, never be excused. It was a small measure of justice in a world where the damage could never truly be undone. As the brothers were escorted out of the courtroom, they had nothing left but the cold reality of their actions. There would be no redemption for them. The love, respect, and status they had once enjoyed were gone, replaced by a legacy of horror. What had begun as a seemingly perfect life had ended in the worst way possible, with the destruction of innocent lives. This story leaves us with haunting questions about trust, abuse, and the lengths to which evil can hide behind a mask of normalcy. How could such a thing happen? And how do we prevent it from happening again? The answers may never be clear, but one thing is certain. The victims, though scarred, will find a way to rebuild their lives. The justice they received, though bitter, is a testament to the power of truth and the need to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Now I want to hear from you. What do you think about the verdict in this case? Do you believe the punishment was enough? Could there have been anything done differently to prevent this tragedy? Leave your comments below and let's discuss this disturbing case together. And if you haven't already, please subscribe for more true crime stories, discussions, and investigations. Your voice matters in the conversation that needs to happen. The depths of the crimes committed by William and Zachary Zulak were beyond the comprehension of those who uncovered them. What was initially thought to be a loving, well-intentioned couple turned out to be the perpetrators of a nightmare that no one could have ever imagined. The investigation that followed their arrest revealed the extent of their abuse, and as the layers were peeled back, the horrific truth emerged. The Zulaks had created a world of terror for their adopted sons, and it was a world they controlled with chilling precision. These boys had been taken in by the couple under the assumption that they were being given a safe, loving home, a place where they could heal and grow. Instead, what they received was a nightmare that would haunt them forever. The abuse wasn't just physical, it was systematic, orchestrated in such a way that the boys were made to feel that they were the ones at fault, that they were the ones to blame. William and Zachary had groomed them into believing that the acts they were forced to participate in were normal, even necessary. They twisted their minds to the point where the boys couldn't see a way out, where they were so completely manipulated that they lost all sense of hope. The cruelty was unfathomable, and what made it even more disturbing was the fact that it wasn't just happening in the privacy of their home. William and Zachary, once the pillars of their community, had managed to hide their crimes in plain sight. To their friends, to their neighbors, they were the picture of the perfect couple. They were the ones volunteering for local charities, attending church, and making sure they always presented themselves as a wholesome family. But behind closed doors, there was no love, no care, only control, manipulation, and fear. The boys were not just victims of their sexual exploitation. They were emotionally and mentally manipulated into believing they deserved this fate. They had no other reference point to understand what was happening to them, no one to help them escape the twisted reality they were living in. And the abuse wasn't isolated. It was sustained, planned, and systematic. The Zulaks didn't just act on impulse. They used their wealth, their power, and their influence to manipulate and control every aspect of the boys' lives. They used their authority as parents to create a dynamic where the boys had nowhere to turn, where they were completely dependent on their abusers. They would go on shopping trips, attend social events, and post pictures of their happy family, all while subjecting the boys to horrific abuse in the privacy of their home. They had set up a system that allowed them to continue their exploitation, to live in their fantasy world where everything was just fine, as long as no one saw the truth. As the investigation continued, more and more disturbing facts came to light. It wasn't just the physical abuse that was uncovered. It was the deliberate efforts to isolate and control the boys. William and Zachary had ensured that the boys had no way of reaching out for help. They had limited their contact with the outside world, controlling every interaction and making sure the boys knew that no one would believe them if they spoke out. They had built a wall around the children, a wall that made it nearly impossible for anyone to suspect the horrors that were taking place just behind it. When the police finally uncovered the full scope of the abuse, the evidence was damning. The Zuluks had filmed their acts, capturing their manipulation and violence, and shared it in secret online networks. These weren't spur-of-the-moment acts. They were part of a disturbing plan, a pattern of exploitation that had lasted far longer than anyone realized. The footage, photos, and digital evidence were chilling, revealing the true extent of their depravity. The Zuluks had turned the boys into objects, pawns in a sick game that they used for their own twisted desires. When the investigation came to its shocking conclusion, the case was thrust into the media spotlight. News outlets scrambled to report on the horrific crime, with many expressing their disbelief that such a crime could happen in their own communities. The Zuluks had been trusted members of society, respected, admired, and adored by those who knew them. To think that they had been hiding such a dark secret for so long was unfathomable to most people. The shock was felt not only by their families and friends, but by anyone who had ever crossed paths with them. The question on everyone's mind was how this could have happened, and how they had managed to hide it for so long. The media coverage was intense, with news outlets providing every detail of the investigation and the trial. People were horrified by the depravity of the crimes, and social media exploded with reactions. Comments flooded in, condemning the Zuluks for their actions, but also questioning how the system could have allowed such abuse to take place. The case became a topic of national discussion as people began to question the safeguards in place for children, particularly those in foster care and adoption. Were the vetting processes for adoptive parents strong enough? Were there warning signs that had been overlooked? As the trial began, the Zuluks tried to defend themselves. They maintained that they were innocent, that the accusations against them were false, and that they had been set up. They claimed that the children had fabricated the abuse, but the overwhelming evidence painted a different picture. The testimony from the victims, who were finally brave enough to speak about their experiences, was powerful and emotional. The boys recounted the abuse in heartbreaking detail, describing the terror they felt every day and how they were manipulated into believing they were the ones at fault. But despite the defense's efforts to downplay their role in the abuse, the evidence was irrefutable. The boys had been subjected to years of cruelty, and the Zuluks had orchestrated it all. As the trial progressed, the courtroom became more and more charged with emotion. The families of the victims spoke out, sharing their devastation and pain. They had trusted these men, believing they were giving their children a better life, only to find that they had been subjected to unimaginable horrors. Finally, after weeks of testimonies and deliberations, the trial came to an end. The jury found William and Zachary Zuluk guilty on all charges. They were sentenced to 100 years in prison, a sentence that ensured they would never again hurt another child. The courtroom erupted in a mix of relief and sorrow, as the victims' families came to terms with the reality that their loved ones would never truly heal from the abuse they had endured. The Zuluks had destroyed lives, shattered families, and stolen innocence in the most perverse way imaginable. The sentence sent a message, one that reverberated far beyond the courtroom. It was a message that no one, no matter how seemingly perfect, is above the law. It was a message that children, especially those in foster care, need to be protected, and that anyone who exploits their vulnerability will be held accountable. As William and Zachary were led away in handcuffs, their lives forever destroyed by their own actions, the question remained, how had this all happened? How had two men who had everything, wealth, status, and love, become the monsters that they were? The answers were still unclear, but the damage they had caused was undeniable. The story of William and Zachary Zuluk is one of horror, betrayal, and shattered trust. It's a reminder that behind every picture-perfect family, there could be dark secrets waiting to be uncovered. For the victims, there is no quick fix, no simple way to erase the pain they've suffered. Their lives will forever be marked by the scars left by their abusers. But the justice they received, though bitter, is a small step toward healing. It's a small reminder that sometimes even the darkest crimes can be brought to light and justice can be served. What do you think? Should the Zuluks have been given a harsher sentence? Were there enough safeguards in place to protect the children? Let's hear your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories that explore the darkest corners of human nature. Your voice matters, and together, we can keep asking the tough questions. The trial of William and Zachary Zulak became one of the most intense and harrowing experiences for everyone involved. As the weeks passed, the courtroom filled with chilling testimony, emotional witnesses, and the slow unraveling of the truth. The defense and prosecution fought tooth and nail, each side presenting their arguments and evidence, but the facts were clear. What had happened inside the Zulaks' home was monstrous, and no amount of manipulation could change that. The prosecution painted a stark picture of the two men, showing how they had used their wealth, status, and influence to hide the depravity they had inflicted upon their adopted sons. They methodically walked through the evidence, the videos, the photos, and the hundreds of hours of recorded abuse that had been uncovered during the investigation. Every detail, no matter how disturbing, was presented to the court. The victims, the two boys who had been so cruelly exploited, bravely shared their testimonies, describing the years of terror they had endured at the hands of their adoptive parents. The courtroom was silent as one of the victims spoke of the day the abuse began. The child, now free from the nightmare but still carrying the weight of the past, trembled as they recalled how they had been forced to participate in horrific acts. They described the manipulation, how the Zulaks used their positions of power to convince them that this was their new reality, that they had no choice but to comply. The words were painful to hear but necessary. The jury listened intently, their faces a mixture of shock, anger, and sorrow, as the full scale of the abuse became even more undeniable. As the boys described the horrors they had faced, the room seemed to close in on those who had been complicit. The shame was palpable. William and Zachary sat in the courtroom, their faces expressionless, but their lack of emotion only further sealed their guilt in the eyes of the public. It was as if they had removed themselves from the reality of what they had done. There was no remorse in their eyes, only cold indifference. They had been caught in a web of their own making, but instead of accepting responsibility, they continued to deny their actions, clinging to their defense that they had done nothing wrong. The defense tried to argue that the boys had fabricated the story, that they had been coerced into making the accusations, that they were simply misunderstood. But the overwhelming evidence presented by the prosecution made it clear. This wasn't just a case of a misunderstanding. This was the deliberate, premeditated abuse of two innocent children, and there was no doubt about it. The defense's attempts to minimize the gravity of the situation fell on deaf ears, as the court could see the truth for what it was. William and Zachary had spent years building a facade of normalcy, attending social events, hosting charity fundraisers, and presenting themselves as loving fathers to the world. But as the truth came to light, the public image they had carefully crafted was destroyed piece by piece. The media had been relentless in reporting the case, and as the trial unfolded, the public's outrage only grew. How could two men so respected in their community do such unspeakable things? How could they betray the trust of their adopted children, who had been placed in their care to give them a better life? The questions seemed endless, and there was no easy answer. The media's coverage was a storm, with every detail of the case being exposed for the world to see. The Zulaks' personal lives were put under a microscope, and the public learned about their financial struggles, their increasing paranoia, and their growing resentment toward their adopted sons. What had begun as a simple family dynamic had transformed into something dark and twisted, something driven by power, control, and sickening desires. The couple's seemingly perfect life was nothing more than a house of cards, one that came crashing down as the truth was revealed. The victims' families were equally devastated by the case. They had trusted the Zulaks to care for their children, to provide a stable home for children who had already experienced trauma in their young lives. Instead, they had been subjected to the worst kind of abuse, and now their families were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered trust. The emotional toll on the families was evident in the courtroom. The victims' families took the stand to testify about how the abuse had affected them, how it had torn their worlds apart, and how they had struggled to come to terms with what their children had gone through. It was heartbreaking, and their pain was shared by everyone in the room. As the trial neared its conclusion, the world waited to see what the final judgment would be. Would the Zulaks face the full extent of the law? Would they be held accountable for the suffering they had caused? The tension in the courtroom was palpable. The prosecution had done their job, presenting an airtight case that made it impossible to deny the Zulaks' guilt. But the defense had fought hard, presenting every possible argument to shift blame, to deflect responsibility. When the judge read the verdict, the room fell into complete silence. The brothers were found guilty on all charges: aggravated child molestation, sexual exploitation of children, and child trafficking. There was no leniency, no reduction in the charges. The judge made it clear that what had happened was so heinous, so unforgivable, that the only appropriate sentence was one that would ensure they would never again harm anyone. William and Zachary were sentenced to 100 years in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted with mixed emotions. Some people wept, feeling relief that justice had been served for the boys who had suffered so terribly. Others felt the sting of knowing that no amount of punishment could truly undo the damage that had been done. The victims' families, who had been through so much, now had to face the fact that their children's trauma would never be erased. The 100-year sentence, while fitting, could never truly fix what had been broken. But it was justice nonetheless. The message was clear. No one, no matter their wealth, no matter their status, is above the law. The Zulaks' actions were unforgivable, and they would pay the price for the pain they had inflicted. In the aftermath of the trial, the boys were placed in new homes, their futures uncertain but filled with hope. They would undergo years of therapy and care, slowly learning to rebuild their lives and recover from the deep wounds they had suffered. It wouldn't be easy, but they were free now, free from the men who had used them as tools for their perverse desires. The case, however, left behind a trail of questions that would linger long after the trial ended. How had the Zulaks been allowed to adopt children in the first place? Were there warning signs that had been overlooked? Could this have been prevented? And how do we ensure that vulnerable children are never again subjected to such abuse? These questions would haunt the public as they tried to come to terms with the truth about what had happened, and as they work toward creating a future where children are protected from the kinds of monsters that lurk behind closed doors. As the Zulaks were led away in handcuffs, the cold finality of the sentence seemed to mark the end of their reign of terror. But for the victims, the road to healing was just beginning. And as the public grappled with the implications of the case, the hope remained that justice had been served, and that no child would have to endure what these boys had suffered. But as we reflect on this case, we must ask ourselves, how much responsibility should we as a society bear for allowing such a tragedy to happen? How can we better protect our children and ensure that something like this never occurs again? I want to know what you think. Do you think the punishment was enough for the Zulaks? Should there have been a harsher sentence? What changes need to be made in our adoption system to protect vulnerable children? Please share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's have a conversation about how we can make sure that children are never again placed in harm's way. If you found this case as disturbing as I did, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more true crime stories and discussions. Your voice matters, and together, we can continue to ask tough questions and ensure that justice is always served.